Hello to you all. It is your Professor Kramer. We have our final installment on the problem of evil and a response to it from John Hick, which has been anticipated since our previous reading, in fact, where we saw Marilyn McCord Adams reference the distinction between St. Irenaeus and St. Augustine, which we will return to. This is a central part of Hick's argument of scriptural interpretation and debates within what he'll call the Church Fathers, the minority report versus the majority report. He'll take the minority report position, the one adopted by Tom Cruise. It's a little bit of levity here for our third week, I guess, in quarantine. I'm not sure if it's the third week. I've lost track. I've been etching little lines in our kitchen wall for the many days. It'll come off, I'm sure. I've been using, I think it's a non-permanent marker. Anyway, quick reminder, I'm recording this now on the April 21st, day after my wife's birthday, by the way, if that's relevant to anyone. You don't have to get her anything. Sadly, she shares a birthday with another dude who makes an appearance quite often when the philosophy of evil pops up, and that, of course, is Hitler. So, that's unfortunate. Please remember, we're nearing the end of the semester. You have a paper due. You can turn that in early, get it out of the way so that you can work on, practice, or prepare for other things like exams and so on. If you have questions about that paper, please post those questions in the first module where you got the Q&A, so that any questions you have about it, other students will see my replies and they don't have to simply repeat those replies. But you should certainly be looking into that now. I focus on a topic that is of interest to you first and foremost, and then start work. In that way, you'll be able to devote more time and energy and interest to it, which increases the likelihood you do well on it. There are a lot of possibilities within this class. If you want to write about something that's not obviously covered in this class, please let me know before just turning it in. I need to be able to okay that as a possible paper topic. Follow the grading rubric. Please copy and paste that grading rubric that's posted in the guidelines for this paper. I use that to show you that where the point structure is, and you can even outline your papers by numbering the parts of the paper. I'm totally fine with that. I'm not as concerned about aesthetics here. I'm looking for your logical, philosophical arguments. All right. And the exam, the test times have been posted by administration. I'll, of course, once I get the test written up, it's all online. I'll give you the details of that as we get closer to it. It'll be the same structure as the midterm exam, part multiple choice, part essay. Okay, let's get to it. So, John Hick has a very interesting theodicy. It's called the soul building or the soul making theodicy. This concept he gets from a poet, John Keats. You've probably heard of John Keats before. This phrase, the veil of soul making. This earth is a kind of testing ground for the development of our character. And this he borrows from the church father known as St. Irenaeus. And then you see, bringing out these slides again, the very first slide, we have St. Augustine saying, "Hey, Irenaeus, we are all born into original sin due to Adam's crime," or Eve as well. It's wholly up to God whether or not we are saved. We are born into the condition. We are fallen to begin with. We are poorly I don't want to say were poorly constructed. There's a huge debate within the church, within Christianity, and with philosophers of religion. And Hick addresses this in the larger text. You only have a section of this from his book, Evil and the God of Love. But in that he addresses the Irenaean view and the Augustinian view. He addresses philosophers like Alvin Plantinga, Peter van Inwagen, and others in their debates about this. But it's not clear what interpretation makes the most sense. Is St. Augustine correct that, and he has the majority view, by the way, he's the majority report. Most followers of Christianity follow St. Augustine's view that there was Adam and Eve in a paradisical pleasure park known as Eden. They, as you recall, there's some dilemmas with this logically, but they were like children prior to having chosen their first transgression against God, which was, of course, to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And as you recall, that's the knowledge of good and evil. This poses some logical problems, and ethical too. If it is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the assumption there is that they could not have known the difference between good and evil until they had eaten of the fruit. And in fact, this is our justification for not visiting punishments upon children, or if we do so with mitigation, or at least we should. I've talked about spanking children before. That seems such an odd response, but I guess some people still do it. But we don't punish a 2-year-old with the threat of death. We don't punish the 8-year-old with the threat of death. We certainly don't punish the 10-year-old with, unless we're in Texas, I guess, with the death penalty if they've committed a crime that might have been otherwise seen as absolutely horrible. Part of Hick's response to the Augustinian view is that this singular individual life, let's give us 100 years. You live 100 years, that doesn't seem long enough to justify either eternal reward in heaven with God, or especially eternal punishment in hell. And this we can review from our discussion with Adams, and of course with Hitler. The idea from Irenaeus is that we are continually developing. After all, if an infant is killed, it seems odd to think that that infant is now in heaven with God. What was the point of the infant's existence? To be around for 9 months in the womb, and then let's imagine lives, a day. I mean, these are terrible ideas, of course, terrible thoughts, but these are terrible times. They just happen. But from Hick's perspective, and Irenaeus, whom he's borrowing this from, it doesn't seem to make any sense whatsoever. Wow, that was a flock of birds. Sorry, it's just a huge flock of birds just flew by. Immediately, thoughts of plague jumped into my mind. Looks like it's fine. They're just flying about. Anyway, I would ask you where I was, what I was saying moments ago. I guess I could pause, or what the hell was I talking about? Anyway, the infant that dies. Yeah, right, that joyful thought. Hick does not find that to make any sense, that a omnibenevolent being would create a world in which there were children born to simply die. The relationship that even God could have with such a being would be very strained, very strange. The child could not have achieved maturity sufficient to be in a loving relationship, a willfully, freely chosen love of God. This is what Hick is driving toward. The whole point of humans' existence for Hick is to mature, to develop their souls, to become the appropriate kinds of beings that are capable of being in a loving relationship with the divine being. That's the ultimate goal. It's a teleological account. Teleology, again, the study of ends or purposes. And so he adopts the minority report. And there may be good reasons for it being a minority report, as we'll see. For Augustine, there is this life, this world, And that's it. John Hick here, he's an image of him in his youth. He passed away in 2012. He comes up, as you noted from our previous discussions, a lot in the philosophy of religion. So recall from our discussion from Adams, finite agency and the problems of infinite punishment. We don't need to rehearse this again in much detail, but it seems inconsistent. It seems disproportionate from our, again, finite moral standpoint, which of course is what we're going to transition into after this lecture, when we look at Plato's Euthyphro, when we look at the relationship between religion and morality. But it seems disproportionate that we punish an individual eternally for any finite harms that they have done. And this is true for any situation, according to Adams at least, and I think Hick as well. What should be the punishment for our transgressions? Even if we go full Hitler on the world, it seems that the sins of someone like Hitler, and I remind you of and I rehash these slides because it took me so damn long to fill in these timelines where Hitler is born in 1890, and then in 1944 he becomes, basically the horrible monster that we know him to be, and then he's dead. And then in that, or after that 56-year life, he did some amazingly horrible things. Nevertheless, they were finite horrors. And what is the result of these finite horrors? The presumption is, at least on the Augustinian view and the majority view, he's suffering eternally in hell. It's an eternal punishment for a finite crime. And if we go back to the characteristics of God, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, it's hard to make sense of a just and merciful God that creates a place, or a concept if you want, in which people are created simply to exist in eternal suffering. So Hitler was created, it seems, and at least allowed to, cause unbearable suffering to untold tens of millions of people, and then for himself to suffer unbearable suffering, eternal torments. Do you see the problems here? Now, maybe God did not know what Hitler would do. Recall the important discussion of omniscience. What does that entail? Does God know everything, including the future? On the traditional conception, that seems obvious. God knows what we're going to do. That's different than causing us to do it, to be sure. That requires argument, but it's not obvious that God's foreknowledge as a divine omniscient being doesn't make the world the way that it's going to be regardless. So if God knows what's going to be in the future then has to be as God knows it. And if Hitler is going to choose genocide, then God, in his omniscience, knows this. Not just in 1890 does God know this. God knows this before Hitler is even allowed to be instantiated. This is to say, God chooses to create a world in which there is a Hitler who causes genocide, and then within a blink, right? 56 years in contrast to eternity is not even a blink. It's not even a mere nanosecond. So his existence is really mostly eternal torments. From that perspective, Hick tells us, we have a malevolent God, an all-evil God, not a good God. So, Hick, as we see on slide 6, clearly does not agree with St. Augustine. Instead, he takes the Irenaean view, the Minority Report. We begin as immature children. It's almost an evolutionary account, coupled with the Irenaeus theology of soul building, where this life is too short. It's too short clearly for infants, but it's even too short for somebody who lives to 100 years old. Hick is clear that his particular Christianity is the ultimate path, which means someone like the Dalai Lama, who may live a long time and be incredibly compassionate and kind and good and follow all the precepts, let's say coincidentally, of Christian faith without adopting the particular correct viewpoints, correct beliefs, and therefore a loving relationship with the Christian God is not happening. That means the Dalai Lama is going to have a lot more goes at it, so to speak. Happily for Hick, I guess also for the Dalai Lama, the notion of reincarnation, which is central to this Theodicy, that metaphysical view of reincarnation of the soul, of the self, is essential. In fact, that's the central premise, or we might even call it a presupposition, at least on the reading you had here. He does not give the arguments, but to be fair to him, this is a very short selection from Hick and his book, Evil and the God of Love. But there is the necessity of multiple lives, right, that are required for us to fully mature. So we begin, as Adams puts it, if you recall, as immature children with inaccurate, not fully conscious, and in part conditioned perspective of the world. I think Adams there is borrowing from Hick, actually, if you recall. Adams' reading is after Hick's, chronologically. And Hick agrees with this notion that we didn't have a fall. The fall of humanity seems so strange to Hick. Imagine human beings, Adam and Eve, being already in a loving relationship with God, being confronted with God, starting out good but falling. That's what the presumption is. How is it that the fall was even possible? Is a question that Hick is asking. It seems very difficult to make sense of, to be confronted with God right there. It's not a matter of God being hidden. There's no question for Adam and Eve. Does God exist? Yeah, he's right over there. At least if we take certain scriptural passages literally. Where are you, Adam? Oh, here I am. There is an interaction with them. They are there, confronted with God in front of them. It is the eternal divine parent, unmistakably before them. To Hick's mind, it is inconceivable that Adam and Eve could have betrayed God or gone against God in that particular situation. It's not inconceivable to Hick that those who, for whom God is hidden, which, by the way, is everyone from the outset, something I'll return to later, that they might not develop, they may not move toward a loving relationship with God, because, after all, God's existence is not obvious. If it were, it would be a forced relationship, Hick thinks. He sees God as the divine hypnotist, where it's impossible to be confronted in the face of God and not believe in God and not accept God. But he thinks that is not the kind of loving relationship that one would want. It's not a real relationship at all. It's akin to, I don't know, a spouse hypnotizing her spouse and making him or her love them. This, of course, is not an actual relationship. So, even for Hick, he says this, he calls us relatively free and autonomous persons. Says this on the top of 222, first column. Adams uses the term impaired freedom. I think impaired freedom is nice. It gets more at what Hick is actually trying to say. Relatively free is too vague to really make sense of. This is very different, though, than the very robust libertarian conception of freedom that Plantinga assumes in his free will theodicy. We'll have to return to this question. How impaired, how free are we in any of our instantiations, in any of our incarnations for Hick? Again, Hick does not advocate for there being an eternal hell. He speaks more of a kind of conception of purgatory, this middle ground. Well, I guess it's not a middle ground at all, because there is no hell. It's an after, what does he call it, para-eschatological. It's studying of the end of times, but not quite there. It's not quite the end of times. The idea is that we get reincarnated, we exist in a state in which we're constantly attempting to grow. And he does admit that it can be difficult, and he does admit that it's not going to be pleasant for everyone, and that it comes in degrees. For some people, they mature much faster. This is a reasonable idea, and therefore the number of reincarnations to achieve the appropriate maturation, character, soul, to be appropriate to be in a relationship with God is going to be fewer than others. Hitler may take millions of lives. Who knows? I mean, he requires a kind of Buddhist interpretation or Eastern philosophical interpretation of reincarnation, which he does discuss in the suggested readings I posted, which again, you're not required to do those, but if you are interested in, Hick does have, it's not too long when I've posted it under the sections, suggested readings, links, and videos, John Hick's Reincarnation and the Meaning of Life. This was in 2002. And it couples nicely with his readings from Evil and the God of Love, which is what you had for today, which you had for this reading. So, again, on slide 7, we are in the process of being perfected. We don't start off as perfected. And it's not inevitable. He says this, it's not inevitable to happen in a particular lifetime. I think he would have to qualify that, because it is inevitable for everyone, because there is no hell. There is no eternal hell for John Hick's ontology. We will eventually, some take longer than others, and I guess that's the suffering aspect of it. Some will suffer more than others over longer periods of time. But we will eventually all make it there. The question here, and his question is, how might this belief that in there being the potential for multiple lives, multiple instantiations, each of which he calls a phase in our character construction, that we play a role in, again, we are at least relatively free, how would that affect our choices in this life? And this is a fascinating question. And in the suggested reading, which I'll just quote from here at length, he quotes from Milan Kundera's awesome book, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. Milan Kundera borrows heavily from Friedrich Nietzsche and other existentialist philosophers. And he considers Friedrich Nietzsche's conception, this thought experiment of the eternal recurrence of the same. Nietzsche is asking us, it's debatable what Nietzsche means by this. Some say he's advocating for an actual scientific, metaphysical worldview in which, indeed, the infinity of the universe entails that everything will be replicated an infinite number of times. So this could be him stating what he takes to be a metaphysical fact. Another alternative interpretation that I tend to lean toward is that it's a moral thought experiment in which he asks us, imagine that you would relive your current life exactly as you're currently living it, but for eternity. You will eternally return to this same life in every minute detail. If you were to do that, could you live this life? How would you live this life? Knowing that you were going to eternally return to every single instant, every single facet of it would be the same. Could you live such a life? And how would that affect the way that you do? Would make important your decisions. They would weigh heavily upon you, as opposed to the unbearable lightness of being, as Kundera puts it. Here I'll quote from Hick, who's quoting from Milan Kundera. He says, returning now to Kundera, in his imagined scenario, we do not know, in the first world, what the future holds. Suppose, however, we had come to the belief that we are, in fact, taking part in a journey from world number 1 to world number 5, and then to yet further worlds beyond. Would this not change the way in which we experience and engage in our present life in world number 1? the world, as he says, of immaturity? Would it not give a new and different meaning to what is now happening? Borrowing from John Bunyan's image of life as a pilgrimage toward the celestial city, the events on the journey, both its pleasant and joyful moments and its unpleasant and terrible moments, have different meanings for the pilgrim who lives in faith in the reality of the celestial city from that which it has for those who have no such faith. In other words, this is a kind of Jamesian pragmatism. How will you live your life based upon what your beliefs are about the future? He goes on, the cosmic optimism of the world, religions, and remember, Hick is a pluralist, and when he talks about world religions, he's pretty much talking about, as pluralistic as his view is, and egalitarian as it is, he's not talking about indigenous populations or what he'll call primal or even primitive. He's talking about Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, for example. In any case, the cosmic optimism of these world religions consists in their picture of a larger process of which we are a part, such that we can live now in trust that, in Julian Norwich's famous words of Jesus in her particular vision, her religious experience, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, end quote. I'm not sure what to make of the repetition there. There's some intention for that. His point is that this, in the pragmatic sense, is going to change the way that we live. It will change our outlook. And you can see this in terms of this particular life. Assuming it's the same, right? Same person through time, which his conception of identity becomes a huge metaphysical, theological issue here as well. But even if this were only our existence, just this, 70 to 90 years, there's still a sense in which there are phases to it. I remember a discussion with a good friend of mine. He had said something like, each new, what do you want to call it, milestone in life, right? When you live your teens and then you get to your 20s, and when you're done with your 20s, you're into your 30s. It's almost as if it's not just a new phase, but it's a different self. Like part of you, your old self is gone. It's dead. You've gone through a reincarnation almost. That's not quite the way he phrased it. But it is a way of looking back into your past as a different phase or a different kind of person. You don't want to say you're a different person entirely, at least not on theological grounds here, because then we run the risk of having a different being in the end, so to speak. I'll come back to that question of personal identity in a moment. Now, on to the question. How does this theodicy, how does this soul-building theodicy make sense of evil? Why is there evil? His response is something like, in general, well, because without it we couldn't develop into what we are meant to be. This is a teleological account. The world is not intended, he says, to be a playground for us God pets, which is a nice phrase. Actually, I don't think he did that one. I think that's actually my phrase, God pets. So, anyway, where everything is perfect, right? The world wasn't intended to be a place of perfection where everything is comfortable and there's no pain, right? This is what he says on 223 under the heading Soul-Making Theodicy. Anti-theistic writers almost invariably, that means they almost all do, he says, assume a conception of the divine purpose which is contrary to the Christian conception. They assume that the purpose of a loving God must be to create a hedonistic paradise, and therefore, to the extent that the world is other than it is, it proves to them that God is either not loving enough or not powerful enough to create such a world. End quote. I'll come back to that later, as that might ring to some of your ears as a straw man fallacy. In any case, hedonism, think of it as a paradise. Everything's great, pleasure, no pain. One might ask, what was the Garden of Eden, if not a starting point of a hedonistic paradise? That's kind of the majority view, the majority report. Adam and Eve had everything, and then they fell. They fell to the pressures of angels who had themselves fallen out of free choice, which of course pushes the question back Why were there angels at all who had the capacity to fall? Not an obvious question. So, Hick says, even with all the horrendous suffering, there is a kind of cosmic optimism. And this optimism, he thinks, is inconsistent with the conception of an eternal hell. Cosmic optimism requires what we already saw with Adam's universal salvation. This is positive sounding. Universal salvation does not make sense for most if there is only this one life. Hitler lives 56 years, causes just horrible suffering, but then gets to be saved. Maybe he's forgiven. Maybe he asks for forgiveness and is given when he confronts God. I don't know that people like that idea. That doesn't seem just. Why would he end up in the same place after just one go of it, one phase, as all of the people he killed? Imagine a murderer who ends up in the same place as those who he murdered. Hick cannot abide by this conception. And so this universal salvation, for it to make sense, seems to require a lot of time, a lot of transitionary phases, which will raise some problems. Because one might say, if there is no hell, then why do anything? If eternal salvation for everyone is assured, then we shouldn't worry. This raises all sorts of potential contradictions. The idea of cosmic optimism is inconsistent with hell. The idea that there is a hell and you might end up there, presumably, if you believe in hell, Hick thinks, that should be on your mind all the time. There is nothing more important than avoiding eternal hell because it is eternal, right? I don't know how else to explain this analogically. If you know, or if you believe, you're quite certain in this belief that if you do the wrong thing, you will end up, think of it walking on a precipice. If you go to the left just a little bit, you will fall to your death, and you know that. Very, very, very high percentage chance of that being the case. So everything you do in that moment is consciously being worried of falling. And you, if we take this conception of hell in this analogical case, are always then worried of falling in that precipice, because once you fall, you are there forever. How is it you could not avoid constant neurotic concern about this conception of hell? And on the other hand, this is a problem with Augustine, if you don't have any worries of hell, if you're confident that you're going to be saved, and that way you at least alleviate these constant neuroses of the worries of hell. One concern there is that arrogance of, I'm going to be saved, I don't need to worry about hell. Well, that's too much pride, that's arrogance. Guess where you're going to be sent because of that? And the dilemmas continue. So Hick says we need this evil. And notice, it's very interesting. You don't have it in the reading you had, so I had to go back and search for it. And if you have Hick's book, I have this 1978 revision of it. It was originally written in 1966. And there's some really important stuff, page 304, 305, and his discussion of pain. Pain in the structure of the world. So we might ask, why do we need all this suffering? To build our character. Can we, you've heard that, suffering builds character, right? Whatever, this is the Nietzsche phrase, whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. We could use that in this context. That's become a cliche. Unfortunately, when Nietzsche first said it, it was not a cliche. I almost called him Hitler. I'll talk about Nietzsche's connections to Hitler later, and whether or not they're appropriate, in fact, next week, when we look at Hitler's discussion of religion as resentment, or ressentiment, as he uses the French term, which will be explained later. damn it, threw myself off. Pain. So, pain in the structure of the world. One might ask, what's the point of pain? Why so damn much of it? If God is all good, wouldn't he have created a world in which there was not so much pain? Couldn't he step in and stop the horrible suffering? Couldn't he at least step in and say, and make a world in which, okay, there's the flu, but 30 to 50,000 people a year don't die from it, or make a world in which there's a minor flu. I don't know, people do get sick, but it's not horrible. There's no coronaviruses, for example. Now, to this, in response to David Hume, in fact, we recall Hume, he talks about the need for pain, and this will apply to problems of what we call natural evil as well. He says, for animal organisms, which are part of the material world, are of course subject to its general causal regularities. So think of laws of physics, laws of nature. And these involve, for example, that two solid objects cannot occupy the same region of space at the same time. That's fairly obviously true. And that to a certain degree of heat destroys the tissues of the body. But in a world of fixed structure, animals are liable sometimes to collide with solid obstacles. Like when they fall from a great height, they're going to hit the earth, which is a solid object. Or to be submerged in water, or burned by fire, or fall to hard ground, or become entangled with projecting branches and be injured. And if these animal organisms are helped to live out their lifespan by a protective sensitivity to pain, which prompts them to avoid or retreat from dangerous situations, it is inevitable that this mechanism will be used and that they will, in the course of their lives, experience not a little pain. It's an odd phrase. He goes on, however, omnipotence could presumably have created instead a different kind of world in which pain-producing situations would be systematically prevented by special adjustments to the course of nature. Causal irregularities could be temporarily suspended so that the pain mechanisms of sentient creatures like us would never have occasion to be activated. In such a world, animal organisms would not have to learn to move about circumspectly or cautiously, like squirrels all the time, because all serious hazards would have been obviated by a complex system of avoidance or transformation. The effect would be as though each living thing were individually watched over by a miracle-working guardian angel charged with protecting it from pain. And on it goes. This would be absurd. In other words, there is no logical possibility of God intervening in any degree without intervening entirely. That's his point about the miracle-working guardian angel. Guardian, what does he call it? Miracle-working guardian angel charged with protecting us from pain. That's the ultimate divine helicopter parent. And we would not grow. We could not develop. This is true in this world. I think he's right. My children are not going to grow. Their growth will be stunted, their development arrested, were I to constantly intervene. Make them wear a helmet when they walk outside, preclude them from riding their bicycles, put knee pads on, hold their hands, constantly carry them around. When at school, if I see a fellow student looking at them the wrong way, I go over and punch that student. Well, no, I couldn't do that. Or if I did punch the student, then my hand would be enveloped in some kind of miraculous padding such that I end up only shoving the child in a playful way, and the child, instead of crying, laughs because it's fun. Because nobody could get hurt. The laws of physics would have to be completely different. I could use fire to heat my house. I need that. And if the fire spreads, catches onto my couch or whatever, well, the laws of nature would have to be changed by our guardian angel, and it wouldn't burn the couch or me. It would just simply, I don't know how to explain it, Hick thinks. We couldn't do that. objects falling at a rate, landing into other, bouncing off other objects, they wouldn't cause pain, they wouldn't cause damage. But then, there would be no, that would actually reduce our freedom, because no one could actually be hurt. And so my free will to harm somebody else, to act in a case of moral evil. I intend to harm that person. I attack them. But when I stab the person, my knife turns to butter. I think was one of his examples. If it's not his example, it should have been. It's a great one. And instead of stabbing that person, I just get butter on them. But it couldn't even be that, because then if there were no problems of pain, we would never be concerned about that kind of suffering. And then the butter falling on us, that may be our only problem. Oh, I got butter on my shirt. Why, God? Why is there butter meltable and ruining my shirt? Do you see how that would shift to that kind of absurdity? In any case, I attempt to harm another person, but since harm is not possible, then my freedom, in Plantinga's sense, morally significant freedom, is gone, because there's no possibility of pain. Pain is necessary. It's not just necessary in an evolutionary sense, Hick thinks, to tell us when our body is damaged. It's in fact there because this is the best proving ground for the development of our characters. A world without pain, a world without the laws of nature as we know them, is a world in which souls cannot be developed. All right, let's wrap up on that, or rather move to the problems. Slide 10 has the problems of soul-making theodicy. There are, slide 10, excuse me, I skipped one. Slide 9 here. The first question. This is a bit of a trivial point, perhaps. Is he straw-manning the anti-theistic viewpoint? I quoted from 223, those who argue from the problem of evil as evidence against God. Well, they're presuming that a all-good, morally benevolent being would only create a pleasure paradise, and could not, and is therefore constrained by their omnipotence, that characteristic, to make this world, the best of all possible worlds, one without pain. Surely this couldn't be the best of all possible worlds if there is horrible suffering. A world without horrible suffering would be better. Hick disagrees with that for the reasons I've mentioned already. But so too, I think, do most philosophers who utilize the problem of evil. In fact, William Rowe is a contemporary example of this. He does not say the problem of evil is, why is there any pain at all? It is, why is there gratuitous pain and suffering? Do you see? There's a lot more to the question of the problem of suffering. It's, why is there so much suffering, and why to so many seemingly innocent people that seem gratuitous, that don't seem to have any greater benefit in the end? Go back to Rowe's example of the fawn struck by lightning. So the problem isn't, hey, why does God not make a hedonistic world for us? It's, why are there holocausts and pandemics? Very different question. We can say more about that in a moment. 2, another problem. Is the minority report biblically or theologically defensible? In his book, Evil and the God of Love, he does address, and in fact, uses quite a bit of scripture to try to justify his conception. In fact, he goes so far as to say, I've forgotten what, I had the page, in fact, I think it was 381, no, that's not it, in the full text, that one can only take this on as a matter of faith, which kind of undermines the entire philosophical argument leading up to this point. So he relies primarily on scripture in the end to justify his minority report. The problem there is twofold. Number one, most Christians don't accept the notion that there's no hell, and most Christians don't accept the notion that we are reincarnated in an almost Eastern philosophical sense. So here you find his pluralism being utilized to address the contemporary problems of evil. And so it's not obvious that it's theologically defensible for Christians that there is this Eastern conception of reincarnation in multiple lives, and that there is no hell. In addition, there is the problem of him over-relying upon a faith-based argument, a fideistic argument, a fideistic position, rather, as opposed to philosophical argument. That seems inconsistent with all of the argument that he'd been doing, lo, those 380 pages prior. Another problem, the third problem here is, does this minority report, related to what I just mentioned, and here's the theological and philosophical question, does it beg huge metaphysical questions? To say that the point of this existence is to create and build our souls, and that this could not make sense in just one phase, one incarnation, one life of, let's say, 100 years, much less an infant who dies, after 2 days. Surely that's not sufficient, and therefore the Theodicy requires the metaphysical viewpoint, and therefore we need a justification for it, of reincarnation. And this raises a number of issues. Does the theory of reincarnation make sense in the face of competing hypotheses? Or does it violate Occam's razor? This one existence where we do not remember. For the most part, we don't. In fact, he borrows from Eastern philosophers' philosophy here as well when he quotes, I think, the Dalai Lama. Isn't it a benefit to us that we do not come into this world encumbered with all of our previous lives and the memories of those previous lives? I can see why that is a benefit, but also there's a huge problem. If I have zero memory connections to these previous lives, one wonders what is the moral causal connection between my previous phases. How can I mature if I have no recollection of my previous instantiations? Go back to my analogy of one life in this world. If I have no recollections of my previous activities, developments, situations, acts, beliefs in my 20s and 30s, then what connects me now in my whatever I am, 40s, to my previous self? And if I have suffered complete amnesia, and we can justify that that's the case somehow, let's imagine, it seems unjust to punish me now for something that another me that is different than me psychologically, and in fact different than me biologically too, as you know, physiologically we change every 6 to 7 years in an almost complete way, with all of our cells being replicated, carried over, transformed. This seems hard to accept. There's another issue with this, borrowing on, continuing with the problem number 3, what about souls? This, of course, requires, this doesn't seem like a big issue because I think most people presuppose the existence of souls. Think about the number of people who believe in heaven. That's a large number, 72%. The number of people who believe in hell, that's a smaller number, like 58%. But the number of people who believe in souls, non-religious people who believe in souls, that's a huge number. However, unless we have some justification for the existence of souls, then the question of reincarnation becomes, again, pushed back. So, in order for the Theodicy to work, Hick has to first justify that reincarnation is a thing. That is not an easy task. And in order to justify reincarnation, he has to first then argue that there are souls that can be reincarnated. Again, this is not obvious. There's a long historical, philosophical lineage, going back to Socrates at least, where this conception of a soul is debated. And he does discuss this. I give you the pages from his text, Reincarnation and the Meaning of Life, which was a suggested reading. 6 and 8, if you want to just focus on that, he discusses issues of consciousness, rightly so. And this is 2002. And then on page 11, he does discuss the Hindu notion of reincarnation. But once he adopts that and uses that pluralistic understanding, taking from other faiths and trying to make sense of a contemporary issue in his own faith, he brings in some problems. Which conception of the soul are we going to adopt? The Buddhist interpretation, for example, is that the soul is like a flame. You can take a flame from one candle and light another candle. Now that flame, now you have two flames. That initial flame that lit the second candle could blow out. What flame is it in the second candle? Is it the same? And what do we mean by same? For many in the Buddhist and many Eastern philosophical interpretations, reincarnation is in fact replicate or the continuation of karmic energy, which does not necessarily entail individuality. In fact, one of the goals of attaining enlightenment within Buddhist thought, Buddha means enlightened one, is coming to the recognition that everything is interconnected, that there is not an individual identity through time in this life or in the next. And once you realize everything is interdependent, everything is interconnected, everything is one, we are like bubbles on a great ocean. We are not separable entities with selves that seek things for that self. If you recall, that is what causes suffering. Once you get rid of that notion of an enduring self, you get rid of that notion of a me, a my, an identity where I want things and you don't get them. You release that desire, and that desire which causes suffering. Now, this Eastern tradition is not consistent with the Western tradition of a heaven and hell in which I am punished. I am rewarded. Not somebody similar to me, not something qualitatively similar to me, or where there's not a me at all. Conception of heaven and hell make no sense if we do not maintain personal identity. All right, on fourth problem. There's a lot of questions we can raise here. Slide 11, we ask, what about animals? Dinosaurs in particular. Does Hick's soul-building theodicy address questions like this? Natural evils. Free will is a huge part of his view, of course, and we already discussed the conception of reincarnation and building of ourselves. But are animals also to be character building? And what about the 99% plus of species that have gone extinct? How is it that they can be explained under this theodicy? Do they have freedom? Right? He doesn't really talk about the freedom of animals. There's others who do. Richard Swinburne, for example, has an interesting theodicy. But in both cases, Swinburne and Hick, the view is that the animals and their suffering are ultimately here for our purposes. We build up the greater capacity for compassion given animal suffering. And in a way, they're here to help build our characters. This has some obvious problems to it when you think about animals' capacity to feel pain. And again, why do they feel pain? We'll go back to the long quote I gave you of the laws of nature and the laws of physical stuff and the requirement that there be the world the way that it is. But one asks, what in the world are dinosaurs doing? They went extinct millions and millions of years ago. How in the world is that relevant to our building of character? Presumably these dinosaurs had the capacity to feel, to suffer. What do they or the world gain from it? Presumably there are species we never knew about that suffered horribly and died and went extinct. It's unclear how that has any connection to our character building. And even if it does, what an odd construction. We are back with Aloysia and Ivan from Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. Would you create a world like this in which creatures suffer for the benefit of others? What else is happening here if not a situation in which creatures are created solely for our own benefit and they just exist, suffer horribly, and then die? I guess you can look at PETA's interpretation of the mass production of animal agriculture. this doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless we think the animals are there only for us to use. And their suffering, though great, just watch one video smuggled into a factory farm or a slaughterhouse, and you'll realize, holy shit, these animals do not have a good existence. But we might say, too bad. The good that comes from it is greater than their suffering. Maybe. It seems like a very strict utilitarian argument. And finally, the fourth problem, what's known as the parent analogy again, something we've talked about before. Hick uses this. He says God is akin to a parent, and we don't want a parent to be neglectful. And there's different ways of neglect. There's a kind of neglect by giving too much and shielding your children too much from reality. There's no question of that. I think that makes sense. But the problem is, in order to maintain this Irenaean view, Hick has to say, we were not created perfect and with God in the moment. Because if we were already perfect and before God, right there with us, there would have been no way for us to fall and no need for us to develop. We couldn't mature. We would remain infants or something like that. And so there's a conception in which, of course, isn't it in fact obvious, there's a philosopher, Michael Ray, who puts it this way, that this world is such that we would expect God to be hidden, because if God wasn't hidden, if God was right there in front of our faces, it would be impossible for us to not believe in such a God. Our hands would be tied, we would be forced. We're back to Hick's conception of the God as the divine hypnotist or something like that. The problem is, we could expand on Hick's conception of our limited freedom. If we are brought into this world because God desires us, which is another interesting question, why are we brought into this world at all? The question he raises with respect to why is there pain? Well, because we're physical creatures. All right, that pushes the question back. Why did God make us as physical beings? There are such things as angels, so those are logical possibilities, and it seems the ultimate goal is to get back to a state like that. Why physically instantiate us at all? That question is not obvious, other than to say, well, that's the best way to develop our souls. Which is strange. Why does becoming corporeal stand as a necessary criteria for our incorporeal souls? And why would we be so separated? Because remember, for the vast majority of the world's population, they are not Christian. They do not accept Hick's particular theological viewpoints. That means God is hidden and purposely remains hidden from most people on this planet. And that hiddenness perpetuates further epistemic distance, right? If I am a parent and I don't want to be a helicopter parent, so I'm not with my kids every second, we take this analogy too far, we realize I could distance myself and become an absentee father and not be there at all, such that my children are undergoing pain and suffering and have no reason to believe in my existence. This seems to be the state of most people throughout most of history. Again, because most of them are not Christian. And to get to reading for next time, our God-given reason seems to be used to justify the claim that there is no God. Right? And there's I think it's Stendhal who put it this way, the only defense God has with respect to the world being filled with so much evil is that God doesn't exist. That's the only defense he has, which I find, I think it was meant to be a joke. But some interesting stuff in that. All right, and then another problem with the parent analogy, it's perhaps another straw man, it's a question. A good parent, he says, does not treat pleasure as the sole and supreme value. End quote. Agreed. That's true. A good parent doesn't say, I'm going to bring my kids up so that they only experience pleasures and have no pains whatsoever. Brushing their damn teeth every day, twice a day, causes enormous pain and suffering in our household. Nevertheless, we go through it because it's necessary. Having problems with teeth is terrible. But we also, as good parents, teach our kids virtues such as courage, compassion, even humor. He mentions this because it's important in this horribly shitty world, somebody might say. I wouldn't use that language. We need to feel for others and with others. We need to be able to stand up to horrors, and we need to be able to laugh. We need to be able to find truth. And so we confront, or rather, we prepare our children to confront such a world. Clearly, there is suffering in the world, and so courage, compassion, and so forth, these are virtues that we want to instill. But notice it can't go the other direction without engaged in circular reasoning. There is courage and compassion so that we can work toward alleviating suffering. Do you see the problem? Why is there suffering? Why is there evil? So that we can build courageous, compassionate, virtuous people. And why do we want courageous, virtuous, compassionate people? So that we can alleviate suffering. That particular interpretation is clearly circular and problematic. I think Hick would respond, well, that's not the point of soul building, to alleviate suffering. The point of soul building is to be in a proper relationship with God. Fine. Another problem arises then. Once we achieve that state where we are in a proper relationship with God, and all of that, all of those phases of our existence where we build up our virtues and character, why would any of those character traits then be needed once we have that relationship with God? Certainly in heaven we don't need courage. That would be strange. Certainly in heaven we don't need compassion, because compassion literally means to suffer with others. Do we take heaven to be a place where compassion, courage, even seeking truth is necessary? Because if we seek truth, that implies we don't have it yet. That implies ignorance. Heaven doesn't seem to be a place amenable to ignorance. You start to see some of the problems. We spend all of our incarnate physical existence to build our characters, to become a particular kind of person, only to then be not that thing anymore. And maybe we can see that then as a stepping stone, and we become literally different beings. Perhaps that's the case. And finally, good parents. They try to teach their kids right from wrong. Well, that's because parents didn't create the environment in which moral choices must be made. But God, the divine parent, did. And it's hard to escape that fact. We might be free, or at the least partially, limited free creatures. And so God doesn't make us do what we do. But He certainly created the situations in which we find ourselves. And so we have a problem. Not only has God created the world, but presumably God also has determined what is right from wrong, which establishes what we take to be good, what we take to be bad, what we take to be negligent, what we take to be a good parent, for example. And that will take us to our next discussion. The transition here is somewhat smooth into what might be called the divine command theory. This is what we will talk about next time with our reading from Plato, a very famous dialogue called the Euthyphro. And we address what's known as the Euthyphro dilemma, which is, in short, how is it that we get moral truths? Where do the truths come from? Do they come from God and God's decrees, and God's decrees making them good by simply virtue of Him decreeing it? Or does God decree that things are good or bad or what have you because they are good or bad or what have you? In other words, does God appeal to some external source of justification to justify right and wrong? Or does it come from God Himself? More on that next time. Until then, be good. Yeah?